In the class that we are opening today on the Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden, it continues what we had initially started, talking about the fertility of the Mediterranean land, the beauty of the place, contrasting it with the barrenness of the modern day world. Now, this barrenness comes because of the destruction of war. When we talk about barrenness, if you remember in the introduction, we did say that W.H. Auden was familiar with modern poetry, and that came to him through T.S. Eliot. Now, T.S. Eliot's landmark poem, The Wasteland, would have had an impact on W.H. Auden. Now, The Shield of Achilles was written in 1952, well after the World Wars, and it came out as a collection of poems in 1955. The theme of barrenness, or the idea of barrenness, perhaps could have been a takeoff from the wasteland. Because when we look at a land that is devoid of grass, that is devoid of comfort, of food, and yet peopled by so many soldiers who are without an expression and who are guided by a voice without a face, we can see a faceless crowd and a faceless voice. A voice that proves that what he says is right just because facts or statistics say so. Now, this is the voice that is making them to march on even to death. What a voice. Let's refresh our memories with a reading of the poem that we had done in the previous class, but I'm sure listening to his words and his lines is always a pleasure. And as we run through the lines, I'm sure you can hold on to those lovely words that can go on ringing and ringing in our minds. Let's give a hearing to The Shield of Achilles by W.H. Auden. She looked over his shoulder for vines and olive trees, marble well-governed cities and ships upon untamed seas. But there on the shining metal, his hands had put instead an artificial wilderness and a sky like lead. A plain without a feature, bare and brown, no blade of grass, no sign of neighborhood, nothing to eat and nowhere to sit down. Yet, congregated on its blankness, stood an unintelligible multitude, a million eyes, a million boots in line, without expression, waiting for a sign. Out of the air, a voice without a face, proved by statistics that some cause was just, in tones and dry as level as the place. No one was cheered, nothing was discussed. Column by column in a cloud of dust, they marched away, enduring a belief whose logic brought them somewhere else to grief. She looked over his shoulder for ritual pieties, white flower-garlanded heifers, libation and sacrifice. But there on the shining metal, where the altar should have been, she saw by his flickering forge light quite another scene. Barbed wire enclosed in an arbitrary spot, where bored officials lounged, one cracked a joke, and sentries sweated, for the day was hot. A crowd of ordinary, decent folk watched from without and neither moved nor spoke. As three pale figures were led forth and bound, the 3 posts driven upright in the ground. The mass and majesty of this world all that carries weight and always weighs the same, lay in the hands of others. They were small and could not hope for help, and no help came. What their foes liked to do was done. Their shame was all the worst could wish. They lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. She looked over his shoulder for athletes at their games, men and women in a dance, moving their sweet limbs quick, quick to music. But there, on the shining shield, his hands had set no dancing floor, but a weed-choked field. A ragged urchin, aimless and alone, loitered about that vacancy. A bird flew up to safety from his well-aimed stone. That girls are raped, that two boys knife a third, were axioms to him who'd never heard of any world where promises were kept, or one could weep because another wept. The thin-lipped armorer, Hephaestus, hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breast cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. Let's continue now from stanza 3 onwards. As Thetis looks over the shoulder of Hephaestus, she expects to see a white flower-garlanded heifer. Libations and sacrifices is what she looks for. Well, the white flower-garlanded heifer is what would have been a part of the religious pieties that the Greeks were observing. For them, sacrifice and festivity went together. So it would have been a happy gathering, a community celebration where everybody had turned out and they were having a good time. Now, this was a festival time, and this was what she was looking for. Beautiful scenes on the shield of her son Achilles. But no, in the forged light of Hephaestus, another scene was being drawn up. 3 pale figures taken, bound up to 3 stakes driven in the ground. And there they had to face execution. The spot of execution was enclosed by barbed wire, and the lonely threesome were surrounded by ordinary decent folk who were standing outside the fence, looking at them, not moving, not uttering a sound, but watching them all the time. And it goes on to say that the men died before their bodies died. What an expression! No explanation, but just an expression that says they died before their bodies died. The shame of the execution, the shame of losing their pride and their dignity as men, the shame of standing before a crowd of people and facing the punishment. Let me tell you that the shield of Achilles was hammered out by Hephaestus with a 5-layer metal piece. Now, this metal shield consisted of 5 layers that were welded together. he first draws out a rim. Now, this rim was emblazoned with symbols. And then what he did was, he divided the shield into 5 sections, and he started etching out images of the land, the sea, the skies, the sun, moon and stars over the 5 sections. The 5 sections were divided into 2 parts. Now, these 2 parts consisted of 2 cities. One city was a city of peace, and the other was a city at war. Now, the city at peace depicted meadows, fields, even the marketplace. And in the marketplace, there's an interesting episode that Hephaestus carves out. There is a murder that has happened in the marketplace. The murderer is brought to trial, and the friends of the murdered person are demanding justice, are demanding revenge. But at the trial, which is before a jury of elders, a peaceful solution is brought and justice is meted out to the guilty. The avenger is satisfied and peace is restored. This was what was seen in the peaceful side of the city. Now, in the city that was at war were scenes of devastation, of destruction that Hephaestus had drawn out. So Hephaestus was not just a blacksmith hammering out, not just a manufacturer of war implements that he was making on his forge. It was not just an ugly, big, huge field or a shield that he was hammering out, but it was also a work of art that Homer describes. That is looked over his shoulder, and this time what she sees is these 3 pale figures being driven, tied up to their posts and facing execution. Yes, W.H. Auden in The Shield of Achilles has wiped out all scenes of beauty, all scenes of prosperity, all scenes of justice and comfort, and he has just replaced it with manslaughter. What a difference! The sacrifice versus the slaughter. It starts with the sacrifice of the heifer. It also shows a trial and it shows justice. But here, what do we see on the modern version of the Shield of Achilles? Nothing, just manslaughter. Men dying without pride, without dignity. Let me bring you to the setting of the execution scene. It says that board officials lounged and in brackets, one cracked a joke, and they were also sweating a lot because the day was hot. And the rest that were outside the barbed wire were ordinary, decent folk. They neither spoke nor they moved. This was the scene of execution. One set of people deeply interested but not moving or speaking. Another set were the officials carrying out the execution. They were totally crass and unconcerned about what was happening to the 3 men out there. So this was the setting. Now let's look at the men themselves. It says they lost their pride and died as men before their bodies died. So they died as men before their bodies died. The word before is a preposition and it comes between two expressions. Okay, and the two expressions are died as men. When we look at the word man, here in the context of the poem, we look at it as manly pride, the self-esteem that they carried, the dignity that a human being ought to be given, the self-respect. They died as men before their bodies died. Before their bodies died talks about the physical death. So it's a death of the will, death of motivation, death or loss of belief in themselves, and the shame that they face. So expressions that W.H. Auden beautifully brings out along with the setting and the people who are enacting this little episode. Thetis looks over his shoulder to see athletes in the field. Thetis looks over his shoulder for men and women swaying to the music, moving their limbs to a quick dance. But what does she see? She sees a different scene altogether. Now the Greeks were known for their prowess in sports. They were the ones who gave us the Olympics. The Olympic Games were introduced by the Greeks. Well, they were great aesthetes. They loved beauty, whether it was dance or music, and they literally worshipped beauty. They loved seeing beautiful men and women. And this desire for beauty showed also in their longing to maintain fitness in their physical form. So the men aspired to be great athletes. The men worked really hard on the sports field. They rivaled to be the best. And I'm sure if you have seen Greek sculptures, you would see that the human body is celebrated in all its forms. You can see the way, even in stone, they capture the movement of the muscles, and they have such fine features. So we talk about Grecian beauty. Well, Thetis was a nymph, and we can imagine she was beautiful. And Thetis wanted her son's shield to have these beautiful figures of men and women moving their sweet limbs to the quick dance. But what does she see? She sees the modern version of the field. And what is a field? It is the post-war effect of war. It is a vacant lot, weed-choked field, neither fertile nor useful. And there is a ragged urchin loitering about, and a bird just quickly escapes his well-aimed stone. That's what an idle kid would be doing, probably taking a stone and just throwing it around at nothing in particular. And for this urchin, he goes on to say, the screaming headlines of 2 girls raped, 3 boys knifing a third was nothing. They were axioms to him, who lived in a world where one wept and another did not feel for him. Now, war has its effect not just on physical destruction, not just on destruction of property, but war also has its effect on the terrible breakup of community life. people are the building blocks of community. Relationships are what community life is all about. Devoid of people, devoid of relationships, you just have this boy walking around, having nothing to do, nowhere to go, and looking at violence and cruelty as a way of life. The screaming newspaper headlines are everyday happenings for him. He could not care less. This is the death of humankind. At the close of a movie, how many of us stay to watch the credits? Usually most of us are, getting up from our seats and moving out. But sometimes they make the credits so attractive that you just don't want to leave the movie theater till you watch the last image and the last sound dying out. The reason why I'm talking to you about credits is, when we looked at the Shield of Achilles, it was like a drama that was been enacted. Remember, the shield is just an object. But the people, the setting, the landscape, everything has been put together by Hephaestus that gives us a glimpse of Greek life. Now, the same shield has been taken, and Achilles puts a whole lot of scenes that gives us a glimpse of a world that is war-torn, the past, the present, and the future. Well, the past as in the armies coming together, the present as in the execution scene, and the future as in the vacant lot where there's just one boy kicking his heels and throwing a stone, aiming at nothing in particular. Well, that's how he captures, the pre, the post, and the running scene. Coming to the last stanza, it runs like the credits of a movie, because when the poem opens, it doesn't mention the name of the chief character, that is Thetis, the mother. It just says she looked over his shoulder. So there are two pronouns used, she and his. Okay? And the only name we hear is Achilles. That's the only name that we are hearing all through the 8 stanzas. And we know that there's a person called Achilles. And it's the last stanza that says that Hephaestus hobbled away, thin-lipped Hephaestus. Okay? That's the way Homer also liked to describe his characters. He would have this epithet, or he would have this adjective in front of their name that would throughout the epic be used alongside the name. So it was thin-lipped Hephaestus, it was Thetis with a shining breast, and it is Achilles, who is called the man-slaying, iron-hearted Achilles. So the credits are to Hephaestus, Thetis, and Achilles. All 3 of them who feature in this unending drama that started centuries before at the birth of civilization, and it goes on and on and on. The same thing repeated, but maybe the modern version is so drab, so lifeless, and so colorless, thanks to the methods of modern war that makes mass destruction so very effective. Hephaestus was a blacksmith, Hephaestus was a craftsman, Hephaestus was an artist. But today we have arms manufacturers, faceless people, huge factories perhaps. churning out these missiles, bombs, or what have you. And instead of a warrior, we just have ranks and ranks of soldiers marching out there. And instead of a mother, we just have a voice, a leader who's shouting out the commands, shouting out the orders, and making people move to his voice. So it's a world of contrast between the two. I'd like to conclude by telling you that this is not an anti-war poem, because peace is not an option. The war is done and over with. Destruction has been complete. Peace is no longer an option, but it's a meditative piece on war. It's a meditative poem on war that looks at the devastation that war has done, but then perfect craftsman as W.H. Auden is, he's beautifully brought a fusion of the classical and the modern elements of war and covered the whole theme of war with his writing finesse that makes the shield of Achilles still so beautiful.